Monday morning. Good morning. So we continue with our 30 days to better critical thinking, and we are on day 14. Today it is when you think you have arrived as a critical thinker, think again. In other words, when you think you're there, you're not. I'm not. One of the great barriers to the creation of fair-minded, critical societies is that all of us see ourselves as fair-minded, critical thinkers. We all see ourselves, when it comes right down to it, as the source of ultimate truth. In other words, to get to the truth, just ask me. We assume our way of thinking is the best, our values the highest, our perspective the most well-rounded. Republicans and Democrats alike see themselves as critical thinkers. Atheists and Christians, teachers and administrators, employers and the employed, husband and wife, parent, and at least grown child, all see themselves as critical thinkers. What we hope ever to do with ease, we must learn first to do with diligence, said Samuel Johnson. The tendency to lack insight into our ignorance, as we have already pointed out, is part and parcel of every human mind. Everyone has the tendency, whatever his or her level of intellectual skill or ability, and actually that goes for the smartest or the ones who aren't so smart. We all think we're bulletproof in our intelligence and our ability. The phenomena is similar in us all, from highly trained medical doctors and scientists to factory workers and farmhands. Though the development of critical thinking requires diligent practice and deep commitment, as does the development of any complex skill set, people tend to think their thinking is good enough without practice. Most people readily admit, if asked, that they know little or nothing about what it takes to play the violin because they've never studied it. But they do not take the same approach to thinking. They would not say that they know little or nothing about thinking because they haven't studied it. Instead, they would uncritically defend their thinking. The problem is that thinking, the cultivation of fair-minded critical thinking, is not studied seriously enough in human societies. Critical thinking is rarely discussed as such. The term critical thinking is bandied about, but seldom authentically explored. If you ask most people to define critical thinking, they would draw more or less a blank. They might give a partial or a vague answer. They might see critical thinking as something like a formulaic approach to problem solving. Step 1, step 2, step 3. This is what you do to get to critical thinking. It's not that at all. Consider critical thinking to be something you can only imperfectly understand because, like an onion, there's always another layer to it. In other words, critical thinking should be understood as something we aspire to but can never fully achieve. Because we are largely egocentric and sociocentric thinkers, we can never be master or ideal critical thinkers. In other words, since we're always us and thinking about us, we're the own stars in our own story. In a novel, we're the Hobbit in the Lord of the Rings. We're always that hero. No matter, each of us, the millions of us, we're each like stars of a novel. But also, we can't get outside. We're fishing in an aquarium. We cannot think outside our aquarium in the water we swim in. We can't think outside our societies and our language and our community and everything. We can't. the more broadly you've traveled, the more different kinds of societies you've been part of, you begin to glimmer that there's more to how things are rather than your own little world, but we're all part of a little world somehow. So be on the lookout for the use of the term critical thinking. Use critical thinking. Notice how often people use it in connection with what they already believe, like common sense. What I already believe, that's common sense, right? Even though their beliefs are not sound. Notice how rarely people explain their conception of critical thinking. Notice how people tend to assume their thinking to be reasonable, however illogical. Notice how people in the professions, assume they're educated, often assume that those in their profession or their division or their department think critically. You'll hear that. Lawyers are so trapped in their world, their profession, they think if you don't think like a lawyer, you're not critically thinking. Same with doctors, same with anybody. But don't assume that just because you're not one of those, that somehow you're a critical thinker. We're not. None of us. It's a journey. We never get there. But you have to keep walking toward it. Strategies for continuing to develop as a critical thinker. Make a list of all the areas in your life in which you would say you are a critical thinker. For each of these, identify the weaknesses in your thinking. If you can't find any, they're there. Dig further. Make a list of the areas in your life in which you would definitely say you are not a critical thinker or not as good at critical thinking as in other areas of your life. Identify precisely what is wrong with your thinking. Remember, the more details you include, the more likely you're going to be able to identify and address those problems. Notice when others use the term critical thinking. Ask them for their definition of critical thinking to see whether it seems substantive. That's an interesting word too, right? Substantive. Substantive means there's evidence to it. There's things of substance to it. There's reasons. There's thought out, well-reasoned reasons, not just off the cuff because or I think so or whatever. Is there substance to it? Substantive thought. Reconcile yourself to being an imperfect thinker at best, but commit to gradual improvement over the long run. That's what this is for me. I know the older I get, the more your brain begins to slow down. It wasn't as sharp. Now experience makes up for that quickness of thought that we each had more readily when we were younger. But the fact is, it's always going to be a journey until we pass. Write a journal entry or letter to yourself or whatever you want to do. It could be a picture, it could be a video in which the most reasonable side of you is given voice. Quote, theoretically, I want to be a critical thinker. I want to take command of my thoughts, my feelings, my desires. But I still find myself doing whatever it is. I still engage in the following irrational behaviors. I continue to whatever. Nevertheless, I am beginning to notice changes. I am beginning to notice I'm starting to think a little better. That's what this is. This is a journey. You never get there. But you get a lot further down the road than if you never start. Have a good Monday morning.